The rain fell in heavy sheets, drumming against the old tin roof of Daniel's farmhouse. He stood at the window, watching the storm rage across the empty road, when a faint knock pulled him from his thoughts. Opening the door, he found a young woman, soaked to the bone, her hands trembling as she clutched a small suitcase. Her eyes, red from crying, carried both fear and exhaustion. I just need a place to stay for the night," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the storm. Daniel, a single dad raising his little boy, knew hardship well. He had lost his wife years ago and spent every day fighting to make ends meet. Renting out a spare room had become a way to keep food on the table, but tonight, it felt like more than business. Something about the girl's desperation struck his heart. He hesitated only a second before stepping aside. "Come in before you catch your death out there," he said gently. The warmth of the fire greeted her as she entered, though her shivering didn't stop. Daniel grabbed a towel, offering it without question. She muttered a quiet thank you, her voice breaking, and for a brief moment, he wondered about the storm she must have carried inside long before the rain began. To Daniel, she wasn't just a tenant, she was someone who needed kindness, the same way he once had. He had no idea that opening his door that night would lead him into a story far larger than he could ever imagine. The girl introduced herself as Emily, her voice shaking as she spoke, as if even her own name carried a weight she wasn't ready to explain. Daniel noticed how carefully she avoided his eyes, instead staring at the floor as she clutched the warm cup of tea he handed her. His son, Jacob, peeked from behind the doorway, curious about the stranger. Emily's face softened when she noticed him, offering a small smile despite her obvious exhaustion. "Is this your boy?" she asked, her tone gentler now. Daniel nodded, pride flickering across his tired face. Jacob climbed onto his father's lap, whispering, "Daddy, is she staying with us?" Daniel chuckled softly, brushing his son's hair back. "Just for a little while, buddy." The storm raged outside, but inside, a fragile sense of peace began to grow. Still, Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that Emily was carrying a story too heavy for someone her age. She had no ring on her finger, no phone in sight, and the way she glanced nervously at the window suggested she might be running from more than just the weather. He wanted to ask, but his instincts told him to give her space. For now, it was enough that she was safe. Later, when Emily carried her small suitcase upstairs, Daniel noticed the way her hands trembled as though letting go of that bag meant letting go of her last piece of security. Something inside him whispered that this girl's presence in his home was not a coincidence. He just didn't know yet that by giving her shelter, he was opening a door to a truth that would shake both of their worlds. Days turned into a quiet routine. Emily helped around the house, washing dishes, folding laundry, and even reading bedtime stories to Jacob, who quickly grew attached to her. Daniel watched their bond form with mixed feelings, grateful for her help, but troubled by the shadows that lingered in her eyes. Sometimes, he'd hear her crying softly in the room at night, though she always brushed it off the next morning with a smile. One evening, while repairing an old fence outside, Daniel found Emily standing nearby, watching him with a distant look. "You work so hard," she murmured. He shrugged, wiping sweat from his brow. "Hard work is the only way we've survived." For the first time, she met his gaze fully, and Daniel saw pain buried deep within her expression. "Not everyone has to fight alone," she said quietly before retreating back inside. The words stuck with him, lingering long after the hammering stopped. Something about her presence was changing the atmosphere of the home, softening corners of his heart he had long sealed away. He began to wonder if perhaps she wasn't just passing through, perhaps she was meant to be part of their lives. Still, questions gnawed at him. Who was Emily really? Why did a girl with such grace and manners end up on his doorstep with nothing but a suitcase? Daniel sensed her past held answers he wasn't sure he was ready to hear. And yet, he also knew one truth: sometimes life brings people together for reasons we don't see until much later. The breakthrough came one afternoon when Emily and Jacob were baking cookies in the kitchen. Daniel had just returned from a long day of carpentry work, his hands rough and sore, but the sound of laughter filled the house like music. He stood in the doorway, quietly watching as flour dusted Emily's cheeks and Jacob's tiny hands clapped in delight. For the first time in years, the house felt alive again. Later that evening, after Jacob was asleep, Emily sat across from Daniel at the table, her expression heavy with something unsaid. "You've been kinder to me than anyone in a long time," she began, her voice trembling. "But I haven't been honest with you." Daniel leaned forward, sensing the weight of her confession. She reached into her suitcase and pulled out a faded photograph of herself as a child, standing between a man in a sharp suit and a woman in pearls. Daniel's heart skipped. He recognized the man instantly. His face had been on billboards, in magazines, even in business news. It was Richard Lawson, the powerful CEO whose empire stretched across the country. Daniel blinked, hardly believing what he was seeing. Emily's hands shook as she placed the photo on the table. "He's my father," she whispered. "But he doesn't even know where I am." Silence hung thick in the room as the truth sank in. The girl he thought was homeless, broken, and forgotten was the daughter of one of the wealthiest men in America. Yet here she was, choosing to stay in his modest farmhouse rather than return to that world. Daniel sat back in stunned silence, the weight of Emily's revelation pressing heavily on his chest. He couldn't reconcile the image of the lonely, frightened girl who had knocked on his door with the daughter of a man who could buy entire towns. "Why are you here then?" he asked gently, his voice filled with more compassion than judgment. Emily's eyes glistened as she explained. Her father's wealth had built walls, not bridges. After her mother's passing, Richard Lawson buried himself in business, leaving Emily to feel like a ghost in her own home. When she tried to reach him, he dismissed her pain as childish weakness. Finally, she had run, not for attention, but for freedom. "I just wanted to know what it felt like to be seen. To be valued for who I am, not what my last name means," she said, tears slipping down her cheeks. Daniel felt his heart ache for her, understanding in ways she couldn't imagine. He had lived through loss, through loneliness, through nights where survival felt like the only goal. He reached across the table, gently placing his hand over hers. "Emily, you are seen. You're valued. And not because of who your father is, but because of who you are." For a long moment, she said nothing, but the look in her eyes carried the unspoken gratitude of someone who had finally found safe ground. Daniel didn't realize it then, but those words would soon ripple far beyond the walls of his farmhouse, straight into the heart of a man who had forgotten what truly mattered. Weeks later, an unfamiliar black car pulled into the gravel driveway, its polished frame glinting against the humble farmhouse. Emily froze at the window, her breath catching in her throat. Daniel stepped outside just as Richard Lawson himself emerged, his presence commanding yet weary. For a moment, father and daughter stood apart, the silence between them louder than words. Finally, Richard spoke, his voice low. "I've been searching for you, Emily." She swallowed hard, tears threatening. "You never really saw me," she whispered. Richard's eyes softened, the cracks in his armor showing for the first time. "I see you now," he said, his gaze shifting briefly to Daniel. "This man reminded me what it means to be a father." Daniel stood quietly, his rough hands tucked in his pockets, not seeking recognition, only grateful that perhaps Emily's heart was mending. Richard approached Daniel, extending his hand. "Thank you for giving her what I couldn't, shelter, kindness, family." Daniel shook it firmly, the moment heavy with unspoken respect. Emily stepped forward then, wrapping her arms around her father, years of silence dissolving into a single embrace. Jacob cheered from the porch, his innocent joy bridging the gap between brokenness and healing. That night, as the stars stretched endlessly across the sky, Daniel sat on the porch with Jacob at his side. He realized that sometimes, the greatest acts of love are not grand or costly, but simple gestures, opening a door, offering a room, choosing kindness when it's least expected. And though Emily would return to a world of wealth, she carried with her the gift she had found in a modest farmhouse, proof that true family is not built by fortune, but by love.